Now, I would like to call the Committee of the Whole public meeting for March 4th, 2024 to order. I would like to acknowledge that this meeting is taking place on unceded Algonquin homelands. I would like to acknowledge and thank the Algonquin nations for the stewardship of these lands. I would now like to ask if anyone has an interest to declare to please do so now. Seeing none, I will now call for a mover to approve the agenda. Trustee Kaplan-Murth, does anyone have any changes or additions to the agenda? Trustee Lyra?
Thank you. I am asking us to move the boundary review to the first item before the items for action, because I know there's a significant voting public and paying attention to how this discussion is going to go, and I want to respect their time.
Can you please say a number that you're proposing to move this to?
I believe it is item 7.1.
Okay, so we are going to vote on the change to the agenda so that we are all on the same page. We are now voting to move the item 10.2 to 7.1. So, or item 7. So we are now going to take that vote right now. So I'm going to say all those in favor of moving that item up. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and that passes. So we will be now, so now that is item 7. So we are now going to vote on the agenda as a whole with that change. So all those in favor of the agenda as amended. And that carries. Thank you very much, everyone. So we're now going to move to the briefing from the chair of the board, and I would now like to call upon Trustee Scott to provide a briefing from the chair of the board.
And I do not know that I have a briefing this evening.
All right.
Unless the director has a copy of it. This is what happens when you have weather on your way here. Thank you. So I do have a briefing after all. The Education Foundation of Ottawa, in partnership with Stantec, the Ottawa Senators, and the Senators Community Foundation, is offering an award for graduating OCDSB students looking to pursue STEM careers. This award will provide opportunities for financial aid to students interested in STEM-based post-secondary studies who are in historically underrepresented groups such as racialized individuals, Indigenous peoples, members of the LGBTQIA+ community, women, and persons with disabilities. Details have been shared in our previous parent, caregiver, and student updates, and it is always great when we see support for students to be able to pursue careers in science, technology, mathematics, and engineering. That is really good. Next, a reminder that tomorrow evening is the information session about the 2025-2026 Ottawa-Provence Exchange Program. This is an exciting opportunity for OCDSB students to enhance their French language skills and experience the local culture. All the details are on our website. And finally, a reminder that next week, March 10th to March 14th, is March break. There will be no classes, and all of our OCDSB early on child and family centers will be closed. That ends my briefing. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Chair Scott. Are there any questions for the chair at this time? Seeing none, I'm now going to move on to the briefing from the director. Director, please go ahead.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. Good evening, everyone. I would like to take this opportunity to express my deep appreciation and gratitude to all of staff for their dedication and diligence in producing the comprehensive report regarding the elementary program review. The second item, continuing on that, produced in January, which outlines proposed attendance boundaries, grade configurations, and program offerings. This was a substantial undertaking and not easy work on the part of staff. We recognize the effort of the investment made on their part. I also want to thank all participants who have shared their feedback via the online survey on the proposed elementary program model. A reminder that you can join us this March 6th, Thursday, for in-person community meetings There are both daytime and evening sessions that will be taking place. Further details are available at engage.ocdsb.ca. Your feedback is valuable and will help the Board of Trustees make an informed decision about the proposed program model. A reminder that the Board of Trustees has approved the draft elementary and secondary calendars for the 2025-2026 school year. These calendars are subject to approval by the Ministry of Education. For details regarding the first and last day of school, as well as other important dates on the calendar, please visit our website. And ends my briefing.
All right, thank you, Director. Are there any questions for the Director at this time? I am seeing none, and we have no delegations this evening, so we are now moving on to report 24-016. That is item 10.2 that has been moved up in the agenda for all of those who are looking at the agenda, and I'm now going to call on the Director to introduce the report.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. I will be turning this introduction over to General Manager of Planning Services, Planning Department, Karen Ostfachuk, shortly. While she sets up, I did want to share that again, this is comprehensive report is the second part of the comprehensive report regarding the elementary program review. It adds to what was shared in January as a first report. Today's report speaks to attendance boundaries, grade configurations, and program offerings for each of the district's elementary schools. The work that's taken part with respect to this comprehensive report came out of the strategic plan consultation process back in the spring, the winter and the spring of 2023. The impetus for the work taking place around the elementary program review as a driver of the vision exercise has really been the concerns expressed about inequities in accessing programs, particularly French immersion at community schools, and inconsistent support for special education across programs. You will note within the context of folios 58 and 59, a few of the links to previous versions of reports that took place over the spring and into the summer and early fall. The first report, you will note, report 25-002 gave a proposed program model and support for students early in this calendar year. On folios 59, 60, and 61, you'll have a description of current elementary school configurations, which do represent a patchwork of attendance boundaries, of grade configurations, and program offerings over a quarter century in the making, leading to a number of inefficiencies and ineffectiveness at an organizational level. On folio 60, a reminder for the Board of Trustees that although the elementary program review does not constitute a PAR under the guidelines, out of an abundance of caution, implementation of the proposed changes fall within the parameters for the exemption. This includes, where required, specific transitional provisions at some sites to meet the exemption criteria. As a final few comments before I'll turn it over to General Manager Ostfachuk, there are three overarching principles of the program review at the elementary level: community-based education, dynamic bilingual teaching and learning environments, and a continuum of inclusion. None of these are absolute. None of them are perfect. None of them are singular or single-staged. The work that's taking place with respect to the elementary program review is a large, complex change management process that unweaves, in certain extents, some of the program offerings, grade configurations, and attendance boundaries that the district has had and has built up since its inception over a quarter century ago. That's why the work that's in front of us this evening, and quite frankly over the winter season, is so challenging for our organization. I'll turn it over to Manager Ostfachuk to provide rationale with respect to where those boundaries, configurations, and offerings have landed at a system perspective, but do ask that the conversation tonight not get so specific with respect to any one case. It would be impossible for staff to respond to all queries within the context of the meeting, and that those be forwarded over to staff. We'll look at specific examples to the greatest extent we can so that we can keep the conversation at a governance and systemic level this evening. Over to General Manager Ostfachuk.
Thanks very much. Good evening, everyone. I think I'll start at what the district looks like now I want to tell you what we've been tasked to do as staff and what we were trying to achieve and what the plan actually does do. So based on our baseline year that we started with, we've got 119 elementary schools, and that includes Clifford Bowie and Crystal Bay as well, which are untouched in this particular review. We have a number of surplus pupil places in the elementary panel, and of course those surplus places are never where you want them to be, are never where they are particularly useful. And by the time this elementary program review is slated to be implemented, we will have added almost actually 1,600 more pupil places. I believe the PowerPoint says 1,000. There's more than that. If you count Maplewood and the elementary panel there, if you count the Riverside South Secondary School and the elementary panel there, we had Minnow McCann open, and we will have a new school opening in Orleans. And so we'll have to take into account all of those extra built pupil places, all of them in places that we really needed them most. We have a variety of school ages, of school sizes, and of school configurations. Some of our schools have less than 200 pupil places in them. Others approach 1,000 pupil places for an elementary school, one of them a K-6. We have some schools that are less than half a kilometer apart. We particularly have clusters along the old Ottawa Board of Education and Carleton Board of Education boundary line, where the schools were built close to those boundary lines and have sometimes never been reconciled. Most schools are dual track in our system right now, but we have 30 that are single track, and there are 15 English only schools and 15 French immersion schools. Most schools have multiple boundaries. You'll have a boundary for each program in a school typically. Some schools have different boundaries per grades. I think our record for number of boundaries for a school, separate boundaries, is 7. So trying to put those together and reconcile those is a challenge. We have the schools that are in the closest proximity to one another are typically in the core, some of the old burbs, and there are some rural issues that we did try and reconcile. Right now, we have 9 different grade configurations at the elementary level. If you count the 7 to 12 schools, the 7 and 8 component of those schools. We have vastly different rates of program uptake and retention in different areas of the district. And our program locations and the flexibility of those facilities in which they're located is limited, and it's really inequitable. So, what we've been asked to do, this is what planning essentially has been tasked to do with this end of the program review. We've been told to close no schools, and that was not the intent ever of this exercise. And so I want to put that out there so people understand that. We were asked to create community schools, and I think some people will come back at us now that the model is out and say, I don't know how well you did that. When we created community schools, it may not be how a community defines itself. I understand that. Again, we're trying to reconcile 120 schools of various sizes and disparity in their geographic separation. And so sometimes you have to draw a boundary that doesn't meet the definition of what the community defines itself as. We were asked to make each school, even though we have so many surplus pupil places, viable and sustainable going into the future. We were asked to offer program choice at each school that it was possible to do so. Phasing out MFI and the alternative program. We were asked to leave flexible room at each site wherever we could for school use. So rather than loading up a school with a great high utilization factor, we've been asked to try and leave some room at each school. for different uses. That wasn't always possible either. When you're in a growth area that is in a growth mode, you're not going to have any room at a school, and that's not projected going forward. I added what we wanted to do as staff. We wanted to create better feeding patterns, and when I say that, currently we have a number of schools that when you reach the end grade at that school, that last cohort might split in a number of different directions to go on to their next school. We wanted to try and sort that out as best we could. I must confess, in some areas, we didn't get to the secondary feeds and straighten those out. We did our best to be mindful of them. But when it came to elementary schools, we did make sure that entire schools fed into entire schools. The exception to some of those rules would be 7 and 8, where we try and at least have greater numbers because of the way we want to do things. But even then, while we do have some intake at the grade 7 levels at some schools, it's the entire of the feeding school going into that receiving school. And we wanted to create simpler and coincident boundaries. And what I mean by that is when we were attempting to dual track every school, we could dual track. I wanted to see the same English boundary as I did for the French boundary. I think it's more understandable from certainly a community standpoint when they see that coincident boundary, but there was selfish motivation for that also. When it comes to doing accommodation reviews and going forward, and there will always be accommodation reviews, you know, hopefully not another one anytime soon with these, but as you go forward, it's a heck of a lot easier to involve 2 schools than it is to have 7 or 8 schools involved, which is what has happened in the past when we've had overlapping multiple boundaries. And so some schools are very peripherally involved in those accommodation reviews, yet they were called upon to participate, and it took a good deal of their time and energy. And we think we have an opportunity to straighten that out. So what we've managed to achieve with this, no schools do close. Each school was made as viable as possible. Again, when you've got a number of surplus spaces, many more pupil places than you do kids, you can't fix the utilization and load up each school. So what we did in response to that, if we were in an area where we had far more pupil places than we had pupils, we did discuss this at length, and what we have done is create K-3 schools feeding to 4 to 8 schools. There are a number of compromises that come along with this. It certainly adds a transition point, which is something that we have tried in the past not to have, and that can be concerning. Again, we looked at those feeds and we paired up schools. So in most cases, there are 2 to 3 K-3 schools feeding into the 1 4 to 8 school. Oftentimes it's just 1 to 1. We know that the compromise with that grade configuration is that it can split up siblings. We know that when you're pairing 2 schools over a community, that community definition therefore becomes much larger. And for a portion of a child's education, they'll be traveling further from their home to get to that grade configuration they need at that time versus the other school that it's paired up with. All schools have been dual tracked in this exercise with enhanced English and French immersion, with the exception of 4 schools. We didn't want to leave those 4 schools French immersion only. However, when you look at the math, something had to happen. And it's usually a combination of just numbers and geography. And so we looked at typically we have had much larger English boundaries for schools and smaller FI boundaries. If you're looking to have English offered at every school, we had to be mindful of those English numbers and whether or not we thought they were viable. We have over 70% of our intake into grade 1 choosing French immersion at the moment. When you've got those sorts of, now it does even out as you approach grade 8. There isn't perfect retention in that program, But when you have that happen, you obviously need more French immersion spaces, and accordingly, we've got those 4 schools. So while there are a couple of 4 French immersion schools, there are no single-track English schools proposed in the district out of this particular model. That was certainly a concern that was expressed to us, the single-track English schools, and this, as I said, this model does not have it. MFI and ALT phase out, and what that means is year by year, the program will leave the school that it's in. The feeding patterns are improved where we can improve them. Certainly, the K-3s are partnered up with the 4-8s. Boundaries are simplified, and when I say that, the boundaries have been sort of squared up, if you will. We've had a number of schools that have boundaries that we've heard about over the years that have a panhandle off of a nice kind of rectangular geographic area, that have some other inexplicable geographic line that runs through, and we've tried as best we can to straighten those out. Numbers, however, dictated, and so we went and drew boundaries to make sure that each facility could be viable. In the end, however, when you look at that index at the back of the report, we have fewer high highs and low lows. Couldn't all be fixed. When you're talking about a new growth area, I cannot reconcile that. Schools are not built for the bulge in the population. They are built for a period of time, some decades out. And so you will always have crowding there. We have looked to take some schools that were really sort of teetering, and we have tried to give them good, sustainable boundaries. There are a few other considerations that we'd like to point out to you. We have a school that has been funded and very much needed in the East Urban community, Orleans, and it is to be built and opened by the time that this plan is to be implemented in September 2026. We would typically have a working group set up, and we would be discussing boundary and program and grade configuration. And it would involve a number of other schools from which this new boundary will draw. We have actually built in the new school to this model. And so people in that area should be particularly mindful of the boundaries and take that into account. It was not proposed that we do a separate consultation on top of it, or do this particular implementation that, if approved, some of which would have to be undone if we did a second or a consultation at the same time. So that is built into this. As I've said, to make some schools viable, grade configurations have to be altered. And we know that this is a challenge, and we would imagine that that's going to be discussed at length around this table about the viability of those grade configurations, the additional transition point. We are very much hoping that if you have better feeding and better student tracking, that those additional transition points can be mitigated to some extent. During the consultation, we certainly heard that 7 and 8 schools were sometimes a challenge, that only having kids for a couple of years was difficult, and we were asked to see if we could build those into other schools and attach them to different grades, either higher or lower. For now, given the constraints of what we've got and the regulations in which we work, we could not eliminate the 7 and 8 schools. They are still part of the model. We erred on the side of lower enhanced English program numbers than creating more single-track FI schools. Really, when you look at some of those individual numbers at those schools, we did struggle, and we looked at some of those low numbers to question their viability. In most cases where you see low enhanced English numbers, it will echo some of the places where we have low English numbers now, and there's no particular reason to think those numbers are going to pick up. There are a couple of examples in the rural area where that is the case. In other cases where we had low English numbers, we also had MFI programs that were very close there too, or we had the alternative programs phasing out of schools in that area. So there was reason to think that there may be more uptake with English. And for now, having a school start out as dual track is much easier to work into the system than it would be to add a track to a single track school later on. So we tried to err on the side of giving those low English numbers a chance. And certainly where we found that they were just not sustainable, that's where you see the FI only schools. In phasing out programs, we have some grade configuration compromises that may require further amendment. And what I mean by that, I'll give you examples. For example, 2 of the 4 K-6 alternative schools are slated to be JK-3 schools. If we're phasing out alternative in place, at some point in time, you'll have a K-3 community school and a lone grade 5 or 6 as it phases out. We may have to look at those in the future and see if that's the best thing to do for those alternative kids or not. Certainly when we look at the tenants they have, we think that there's good reason just giving the mentoring that they do now and that sort of thing that could carry on in those schools. So we haven't made those determinations to do something in the future with them, but I did want to flag to you that it may be questioned at some point. And again, we'll have to gauge the impact of program change and the uptake at each school. There have been some areas that have historically had English-only offerings in their school. You know, we very much have the literature on our side that says that there should be really good uptake and success in French immersion, but we don't know what people's desires will be. And so we'll have to watch that as a planning department very carefully to assess what the uptake is, and that's going to take some years, I think. As I said, as far as implementation issues go, not all communities are defined as the community would define it. We know that. And most of that has to do with trying to utilize each facility we have and give every school a good and robust enough enrollment that they can be successful. While phasing and grandparenting students is often desirable and has often been our practice in past accommodation reviews, as a matter of fact, in every accommodation review I think I've been involved in, we have tried very hard to phase in, phase out grandparent, which is apparently not the correct terminology anymore, but rather than say transition measures, which I'm not sure anybody understands, we're going to continue to use grandparent tonight. And certainly it's something that has worked for us in the past, but I have to tell you that something of this scale and this complexity, we have presented you with a proposal that grandparents and phases that which we are required to do and no more. And so there hasn't been across the board sibling considerations. Certainly we have considered it internally, but it did not form part of the model. And there have not been any additional grandparenting measures that we have taken. So right now, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the change, between 6,000 and 8,000 students every year in our board make transitions at the end of one school grade onto another school. That's just normal. It's grade 6 kids going to grade 7, the K-3s that we have going to grade 4, that sort of thing. That happens to that magnitude. Given the model that we have, we're looking at 11,000 children being impacted, just over 11, I think it was 11,008, are impacted by EPR implementation. I'm not suggesting to you that that is something that we should just slough off. It's certainly an incredible change. It's also a huge change to staff. And we are taking all of that into account. Some costs are incurred in creating, especially the K-3, 4 to 8 schools, but we've tried our best to minimize that, and we have tried where we have created those grade configurations to find the 4 to 8 schools in schools which have already had the intermediate grades. I believe there is one exception to that rule where intermediate facilities and upgrades will be required to that school. On the flip side, I believe there are 2 sites that have not previously had kindergarten, and they will need some attention as well. So that has been built into this. Certainly the cautions about what will be required. Changes are not felt equitably across the district, and I have to be absolutely frank with you. Where we have a number of schools clustered in very close proximity to one another, where there is a great variation in the size of the facility. In the core, for example, that's where you'll find a lot of our English-only schools. If I'm going to dual track them, I have to take the French immersion kids from someplace. We're not creating new French immersion kids at those grade levels. And so we did have to look at those FI-only schools, all 15 of them, and some of their boundary had to go someplace else to create that dual tracking across the system. So certainly in the core, that will be felt. Some of the older suburbs, there is one in particular that was a real challenge. There is one area in the rural area that was, again, a challenge. The newer suburbs, in contrast, or the schools closest to the Greenbelt, are the ones that tend to be the most stable. Certainly in the new growth areas, it was more stable. Phasing and grandparenting, even for the amount that we have proposed, as I said, that's scoped. We've lengthened the full implementation of EPR for far longer than we want to see. Certainly in the initial consultations, and I don't doubt that people might have changed their opinion on this, certainly given the model that they're now seeing. But at the beginning of the consultation, we certainly heard from people, if you're going to do something, do it. Get it implemented, get it done. And that was actually more common than I thought it would be. Certainly now we are hearing, as a result of the model being out there, that there is more questioning of phasing, of grandparenting, and of sibling considerations. Certainly childcare is going to require further examination, so will transportation. And that's part of the reason that we have that year before implementation. We're doing that in order that we can answer some of those questions that need to be answered. And finally, altering the plan before you. I don't want to say that, nothing can be done, but I would ask you to consider the complexity of what it was we had and what it was we were asked to achieve and did achieve in this. And it's tough. So every time somebody comes forward with a boundary suggestion or a grade configuration suggestion, it is not unique to one school. That sort of change cannot be implemented at one school. It will always involve another school and sometimes has a real domino effect through the district. So can change happen? It can. Will it take time? It will. And certainly the more complex that change is, the more time it will take, or just the sheer number of changes proposed. So hope everybody can see this. It's an infographic that has been done up. And it just sort of gives you a recap of what we have and what we are planning to go to with the full implementation of EPR. I will remind you that there is phasing, that there is grandparenting, and it does take some time to get there. So we go from 9 different type of grade configurations to 6. And those 6 panel breaks, which the teaching community said to us was very important to them. So rather than having an odd grade configuration, a K-4, a K-5, having the K-3, 4-8 made more sense from that perspective. We currently have 4 different program types: English, early French immersion, middle immersion, and the alternative program. We would be looking going down to 2 program types: enhanced English and French immersion. Currently, we have 15 single-track English schools, 15 single-track EFI schools, 63 dual, 20 tripled, 4 alternatives, 5 if you count Summit, and 2 special education centers. We are looking to go to 119 dual-track schools, 4 single-track schools, and 2 special education centers, which accounts for the 4 schools that are added in the time between the baseline of the study and implementation. So I'll leave it at that. I know perhaps the director wants to wrap up.
At this time, the director said that you've done such an excellent job. He has nothing else to add. So before I open it up to questions from the floor, I want to thank staff for the presentation. I know a lot of work went into it, and on behalf of all of the trustees, we really appreciate the work. Before we do get into questions, I do want to remind everyone that we are asking questions on the report that is in front of us tonight. So this is on the proposed boundary and grade configuration report. There is going to be an opportunity to ask questions in April on the whole elementary program review. And if we can keep the first round of questions more of the high level district-wide questions, and then we can dive a little bit deeper. If so, then that would also be appreciated. So now I'm going to open the floor to questions, and I have Trustee Kaplan-Murth, then Trustee Scott, then Trustee Lyra, then Trustee Nash.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. I just want to ask before I begin, so we will be able to go back on second questions? Okay. So to start with, I wanted to thank staff and also to thank staff for answering questions and taking time even after hours to answer lots of questions. So I have questions that are overarching, but they're also, I'm speaking on behalf of my constituents. I want to also start by saying that almost everyone who has reached out to me does support the overarching goals of the EPR, of community-based education, of dynamic learning, and of the continuum of inclusion. That's and addressing existing disparities. People have resoundingly said that they support that. But I have 9 questions, so I'll get through as many as I can, and then I'll go back on the list. So the first question, first 2 questions that were raised by many parents were having to do with schools with significant increases in enrollment and schools with significant shifts in focus. And so the question, which affects Zone 9, it affects Alta Vista and also Central Ottawa, but I think would affect everybody, has to do with concern that there are, even with the new boundaries proposed, there are still schools that are considerably over-enrolled and some that are still considerably under-enrolled. And with the shifts in focus in schools, with some of them becoming, for example, JK to 6, instead of being JK to 6, becoming 4 to 8, there's questions about how we are going to manage that kind of a significant shift. So specifically, why are we planning on having some schools over capacity, even at the outset? What is the resourcing plan for schools that will experience significant changes? And I want to give an example from my district, which is that, or from my zone, which is that some schools that are becoming 7 to 8 are schools that right now are primary. They don't have change rooms, they don't have gyms, they don't have science, music, or other equipment. They don't have schoolyards that are set up for grade 7, 8 students. And at least one of those schools has 9 portables. So a parent asked me, how are we going to fit bigger bodies into smaller spaces? So the question that they're asking is, why was the decision not made to place, for example, 4 to 8 programs in schools that were already set up for grade 7 and 8? How can we better manage the pacing and sequencing of change to limit the disruption for those communities? And how is the OCDSB ensuring that communities with lower socioeconomic rankings aren't disproportionately impacted by that shift in school focus? So that's my first set of questions. I'll continue after. But.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll begin and then I'll turn it over to General Manager Ostachuk. You'll note on folios 66 and 67, and I didn't get into it in the introduction, but there are resource implications that Trustee Kaplan-Murphy speaks of here. And I just want to mention in summary and in spirit, we're really looking at a system-wide refresh of our resources, not only for those schools for change, but all schools overall at the elementary level. That will include the learning resources. I've spoken before about the suite of frameworks we look to put out for our approach to teaching and learning. And we'll give an example in one of the April reports that speaks to the learning resources, because that will be the case for a school that happened to be in the past English only and now is going to dual track. They'll need an upfit, so to speak, a refresh of and an introduction of French resources. That's just one example. Site-based renovations, you spoke to examples where, and General Manager Ossifichuk will speak to why a school may not easily have gone from a 7-8, 4-8 and had to go to a JK to 3. And they will require some school grade configuration changes. That is on both those fronts, the learning resources and the site-based renovations, a normal process of the work we do year in and year out with changes that happen anyway. Most schools are built off of templates. There's no question you do have to upfit for various things. It could be locker bays, or it might be the playground, the play yard, so to speak, various other equipment and resources. We do that on a regular basis, and we'll have an eye in the April report as part of a transition plan to the Board of Trustees to lay out a preliminary oversight of that. So I did want to mention, again, you'll see on the folios a few other examples. Those are two key ones, but are in the site, our sites from an operational perspective. I'll turn it over to the General Manager.
Thanks, Madam Chair, through you. Certainly, we do see some really big shifts in some enrollments at some schools. I would argue it's a good thing. We have some schools that are really, really under-enrolled at the moment. And we have tried our utmost to see that those schools get a good and robust enrollment that can be sustainable over time. In your area specifically, I'll just use those as examples as you asked the question. Riverview certainly goes up significantly in its utilization from about 60% to 123%. And that's certainly the case. Where that happened, we were really mindful of what the facility could take. And certainly in some cases, there was the use of portables contemplated. But in that case, you've got a situation where you've got the alternative program phasing out and the community phasing in. So that initial higher utilization factor is something that we think is certainly manageable at that school, and it's something that's temporary. The same holds true for other schools which are phasing out MFI. We don't think we've gotten to the level where anything is unsustainable as far as enrollment goes. And as a matter of fact, we've tried to be especially careful to see we've evened out where we can. Where it has gone over, we were particularly mindful of those facilities and their capability to either have portables temporarily or use other spaces in the school. And I think I've explained to this group before, but I will do it again. There are some schools that at 100% capacity feel incredibly crowded, feel incredibly tight, smaller hallways. And really when it comes to capacity, it's based on a ministerial formula for the size of a classroom. So I'll just use Lisgar as an example. I know we're not talking secondaries here, but it's a much older, obviously, facility, well over 100 years old. It has a number of spaces that do not meet ministerial requirements, but there are other spaces in that school. So even though the capacity is something around 900 and change, we've oftentimes had 1,200 kids at that school. I'm not saying that's always ideal, but sometimes there's just more room at a school than others. Utilization is a good guideline to look at, but it doesn't always tell the tale. You also asked certainly what kind of mind we paid to those areas that are challenged in this district, and how we're trying to mitigate some of the impact of change. As a matter of fact, in some of those lower socioeconomic areas, we have a good deal of change. And that good deal of change happens to be to offer French immersion where it has not been offered in the past. And so certainly that means change for the area, But during the previous consultations, we heard again and again and again how that was something that we desired to see go forward in this district, to have those opportunities for everyone. And so accordingly, there are changes in those areas that I don't think can be avoided. We're going to do everything we can over the next year. That's why implementation is slated for a year later, to see that we're doing everything possible to support students and staff in all of those changes. So I hope that answers that.
Thank you. So if I'm out of
We'll
time, please add me.
We'll
Thank
add you
you.
on the second time speakers list. So now Trustee Scott.
Thank you, and thank you for the report. I'm going to ask two questions that are about things that are not in this report, because of the many emails that I'm seeing from all across the district on the subject of the changes to programs and boundaries. Two things come up on a regular basis. One of them is transportation, and the other one is the extended day program. So I wonder if staff could please just clarify for the world what will happen with transportation. For example, will the existing policies around walking distances and identifying hazards that would mean busing, will those kinds of things still be in place? Will bell times be examined and possibly changed if the feeding patterns are different? And as far as the extended day program is concerned, do we have any idea when people might have some sense of what we are proposing to do with extended day once we have settled on the basic framework for this transformation? Thank you.
Through you, Madam Chair, Trustee Scott raises a few good points. As an initial comment, I want to be clear and respectful here that as staff, we're not looking to put the cart before the horse. We've got a proposal on the table for the Board of Trustees to consider. We don't have a decision to action, and we will always respect that as staff. So all of my further comments are couched by the asterisks that no decision's been made. Staff realizes that, but understands the nature of the queries now coming forward. Up until now, staff has had since the spring of 2024, essentially a project team that has worked on various aspects of preparing the proposal and the support for students. As the work of the program review goes deeper, that project team is shifting their focus to other operational elements, of which transportation and childcare services, for lack of a better word, are now entering the mix of consideration. There's a couple of points I'll make with respect to the transportation, and that is reviews of bell times, changes in routes, school grade configuration adjustments are a part of the annual work that OSTA does. The Transportation Authority does look at that on a regular basis, and this would be no doubt a larger change management implementation there, but part of their regular cycle of work. And were a decision to be made by the board, staff would begin working on that in partnership with OSTA, or I should reframe that, OSTA would begin working on that in partnership with the board or the district, pardon me. And that's the kind of timeline that General Manager Ostafchuk is talking about, by not having implementation the upcoming fall, but the fall after that. With respect to extended day programs, the vast majority of our elementary sites currently have an extended day program. There are some sites, however, where for one reason or another, the services weren't either feasible or weren't of interest. A good example there is an existing grade 4 to 8 site where in a lot of cases, the parents, guardians, caregivers in the community didn't require the kind of childcare that they would in a JK to 3 site or a JK to 6 site. With the change in some of the grade configurations, that context, that circumstance may also adjust where childcare is needed. From staff's perspective, we'll look for both transportation to make the most seamless changes possible, for the routes to be effective and efficient through OSTA, of course. And for childcare, we'll look to offer that to the greatest extent possible. Our general manager of the early learning department, Julie Sear, is already working in consultation with representatives of the City of Ottawa on what might be coming our way. All to say additional detail will be coming forward to the greatest extent possible in one of the April reports, likely not the first one on April 8th. That would be the recommendation, but on April 22nd, staff would bring back a second report with transitional implementation planning details for the Board of Trustees to have as context were they to approve at the board meeting on April 29th, the proposed program model and support for students.
Thank you for that. I have no further questions at this time, but could you put me back on the list? I will have some detailed questions later.
All right, thank you, Trustee Scott. Trustee Lyra?
Thanks. So my first question is, why can't we grandfather all students? Or more specifically, what would happen if the board were to make the decision to try and grandfather all students?
Madam Chair, through you, certainly in order to go back and look at grandparenting of all students, it would take, we'd first need to know who they were. And we don't always know that if you're talking about sibling considerations. And so that's a bit of a challenge to go back. We also needed to respect a number of different conditions when we were creating these new boundaries. I think the biggest thing that would concern me with grandparenting, and one of the reasons that we did not go forward with it, is that we were trying to make sure that we were leaving schools at a good enrollment with viable programs. If you keep kids back at the sending school each time, it becomes a very big challenge to actually create that viability at the receiving schools. And we wanted to be sure that everyone had those numbers to certainly to speak to success as this rolls out and stability of the program in the future.
Okay. What happens if we grandfathered students school by school or region by region? I have a lot of schools that are under capacity and have space.
And in truth, there can be a possibility of doing that sort of thing at some specific schools, but really we didn't think that the number of schools where it could happen, although we want to, satisfy as many people as we can, there were a great number of students who could not be grandparented. And so there would be great inequity in the way that that was applied. This way, we have done precisely what we have needed to do, and that seems to be kind of a logical rationale, a place to draw that line. If we were to grandparent other, are there more possibilities for it? Probably. I don't want to mislead anybody and say not, but few and far between, and certainly there will be haves and have-nots in that.
So I have made my intentions clear. My intention is to move a motion when this comes back for action to allow students in their antepenultimate year now, or in their grades going into grade 6 in 2026, or going into grade 8 in 2026, to finish out that year at their existing school, so as to not be in 3 schools in 3 years or 4 schools in 5 years. I know you went away to work on that. Do we have any numbers on how many students that will impact, or the places that might be actionalizable?
Madam Chair, I had a brief look. I have not had staff work on it right now. They are consumed with other tasks at the moment. From my very brief and not thorough look, there weren't too many, if any.
Okay.
Trustee Lyra, the director, would like to comment as well.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair, and I'm sorry to interrupt the questions, Trustee Light. I just want to make the point that during the process of the spring season, staff did make that request, or I made that request of staff. I would have liked nothing more than to have had every student exiting their current school, finishing their time out while new students came in. We looked at it in multiple formats. So I just want to say that what you're bringing forward in spirit, staff has looked at thoroughly. We would have agreed wholeheartedly were we to have infinite resources, space, et cetera, to make that happen.
Okay. So in the report, it talks about how SBC classes or specialized classes will continue if the grade configuration allows, do we know how many students are moving out of the K to 3 or 4 to 8 schools who are currently enrolled in special education programs?
Just to clarify, congregated special education,
Yes.
I'll maybe leave that.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll ask Superintendent Stout to comment on the query.
Thanks very much. So I don't have the exact numbers, but I'm happy to provide them. I just don't have them right here in front of me. That being said, certainly have had conversations with planning around 2 particular sites that would be impacted and looking at those 2 sites in particular.
Is there a reason the intention is to move those students out of their existing site versus keeping them there while they get phased out?
I'm not sure that I understand the question. So if the school configuration is changing from, to become a JK to 3 school configuration, you're wondering?
If any consideration was given to allow students in a grade 5 autism class to phase their last 2 years to minimize transitions on an otherwise vulnerable population.
Thanks. So I think that there would be considerations and discussions that still need to be had in that vein. Thanks.
Okay. One of the things I have heard a great deal about grandparenting on special education front is I've had a number of parents reach out to me and say, I have a child with special education needs. What are the options to grandfather them so they have a minimized number of transitions? What would happen if we tried to grandfather every child with a special education need?
And again, to clarify, you're talking about IEPs, not necessarily.
IEPs, non-congregated classes this time.
Then certainly I'll just speak to it from a planning perspective. I don't know how we would possibly manage that. Only because I think you also have to consider the disruption to those kids in a number of different ways. And it may not only be that they're moving schools, but with whom they are moving schools. And oftentimes, if it's a geographic boundary or a program boundary, they're moving with existing cohorts. And I think that speaks somewhat to how they will fit in at a new school if indeed they are moved. I don't know if Kate has anything to add.
I don't really have anything to add at this point, other than to say that we would be, as I have stated previously, really it's around the transition planning for those students and ensuring that we're working very closely with families and those school teams to ensure that solid transition plans are in place. I agree. I think it would be, we're talking about a large number of students, and I think it's also important to recognize that we have a lot of students with special education needs who may not be identified through the IEP or IPRC process. And so I think it's really important to be thinking holistically about this and not necessarily kind of targeting specific measures that I know we do use in special education. But I think it's really the philosophy around the support for students who require that support, whether it's because they're identified as a special education student or not. There will be lots of students that will require that kind of transitional support through this.
Okay. I have a broad concern about the length of time we are expecting to phase out the alternative program. 8 years is a long time to be phasing out the alternative school sites. And so my question is, if the board chose to phase those out over 3 years, for example, what risks do we run if we choose to do that?
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll begin that one and turn it over to the General Manager for comment. When staff looked at the discontinuation of various programs, we looked at what would be feasible. But in addition to that, took into consideration the perspectives of many of our organizational community members, including members of the alternative community who speak passionately and with advocacy for their program. This isn't easy work on anyone's front. As a result, the conversations we were having about alternative as approach versus alternative as a program, we looked back on our own publications, our own perspective, and felt in both our heads and our hearts that this was, by all intents and purposes, a program, and that it deserved, at least for those who are enrolled in the program, to have the kind of phase out that we're offering for other programs such as Middle French Immersion I want to also comment here for the Board of Trustees and the public that I can't find a better example to make the point that we are not doing this for budgetary reasons. What Trustee Lyra is suggesting is more effective and efficient for us monetarily, to phase something out as quickly as possible. Staff has a lot of respect for the alternative community, for the program itself, for the way we will look to integrate the tenants across all of the work we do moving forward. But this is an example of where budget is not the driver of why we're at the table this evening. We're looking to create better programs and services for our students, our staff, and our school communities over time. And for that reason, staff prefers a lengthier process that allows the phase out of the alternative program over as Trustee Lyra said, the better part of the next decade, which will be an additional expense for the district, but for which staff, out of respect for what we're proposing, feels is the best option forward.
So with the greatest respect, Director, my question was, if the board chooses to phase it out over 3 years, what risks do we run? I appreciate staff's recommendation is that it not be phased out over 3 years, but over 9 or 8. My question is, what risks do we run if the board takes a different decision?
Through you, Madam Chair, like other programs that could or could not be phased out, Ministry's interpretation for much of that, and Middle French Immersion is a good example, is that there would be a phase-out process. Our alternative isn't a ministry-identified program. It's an option the board might consider. It's not the option that staff put forward, but it could be an option the board would consider.
And the risks that we run if we make that decision are?
I'll turn to Executive Officer Mark if he has a perspective, or frankly, members of senior staff. There are risks that there could be an interpretation that we had a coordinated alternative as a program, and that for that reason it would be considered a program and should be treated like a program that might be discontinued as other programs are. But that's not as clearly interpreted as Middle French Immersion, for which we are mandated to phase out over time for every student who's in the program.
Through you, Madam Chair, I truly haven't turned my mind to this legally until today. I appreciate the heads up on the question that I did get a short while ago, but I really haven't thought about it legally. So me answering tonight would be a guess, and that's probably not a good idea.
So Trustee Lyra, we can get an answer for you for the next meeting.
Okay. I see 27 seconds, and I think the majority of my questions are now going to be zone specific, so I'm going to jump off the list and come back on later.
All right, thank you, Trustee Lyra. Trustee Nash?
Yes, and through you, Chair. The scope and magnitude of the changes in the Zone 4 Bay in Kitchissippi are staggering. The families are absolutely dumbfounded and outraged. And in many things that I'm seeing in those changes, I cannot support. One of the things parents that are talking about is how blindsided they have been. We have been talking about the program review now for over a year. And this component, which is extremely consequential, now do we see how it will be applied, is leaving people with the thought that this is just a tactic on the part of the board to very quickly make those changes so that we can vote on it. Can you speak to the decision to present this information at this point in our study of the program review?
Through you, Madam Chair, I appreciate the perspective Trustee Nash is bringing forward, the challenge that a large, complex change management process of this nature brings. This is not easy work. I will tell you, if this were easy work, many of these changes would have been made the better part of a quarter century ago. For better or worse, we are a tremendously integrated organization. You pull one string, three other strings feel it. As a result, staff, General Manager Ostrovchuk will not say this, but I must. Staff worked in planning through the entirety of the summer period, the entirety of the holiday break, preparing what is a model that is multifaceted and multi-staged. What the organization does not have as its luxury is for the Board of Trustees to choose A, B, up to J. We are so complex as an organization that there's very little wiggle room to actually be able to put a model forward. And when I look back at what staff was asked to do, to address the equity issues in front of us as an organization, to offer programming at the elementary level to all students so we didn't have equity of access barriers, and much of what General Manager Ostrovchuk took you through in the initial commentary, staff has, by and large, achieved those pieces. They don't come without some difficult decisions. There are aspects of this implementation that have short-term pain for a longer-term establishment of the organization and the kind of feeder patterns that the general manager spoke to. I do appreciate, though, that in some zones more than others, the change is more impactful. So I respect and appreciate the commentary, but staff has worked diligently to put this in front of trustees as soon as we possibly could, taking into consideration all of the factors that were at play and gathering as much input as possible during the spring and summer seasons to put forward the report for the board.
Thank you. Another that's, as I say, having families pulling their hair out, because the basis of what we're doing is to bring students back to their community schools, walking to schools. And I can attest, because I became an occasional crossing guard, because my schools, in the majority of them, the students are walking to school. And on the second point, when we look at the proposal at this time, we're going to now put students back on buses. So there's a narrative right now being widely circulated, and regrettably, it has to do with some comments were made, because again, people are looking as to why us, why not them? But I'm going to be reading something which has circulated publicly. It was made a comment by a trustee, and it goes as following. I don't know what it's like in Woodruff, but in my neighborhood, we sometimes do things we don't like for the greater good. Is this what is happening to Zone 4? Because families cannot understand why they have been targeted in this way, because they just absolutely do not see the benefit. But is the benefit, as is indicated here, it's not in Zone 4, but for the greater good.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll start, then I will pass it off to General Manager Ostrovchuk for some commentary. I think from staff's perspective, our overarching principles, and I will repeat this, are not absolute. It's not binary. It's not black and white. It's not 79,000 students all fit perfectly into this square. It's not without some complexities. And there are cases where any one of the three overarching principles don't fit a particular family context perfectly. I think staff was clear at the outset that this was going to be the case, that this was never going to be a perfect fit all around. And I think we're seeing some of that in the feedback we're getting on the school boundaries piece. I'll turn it over to the general manager for any additional comments, but I really appreciate what Trustee Nash is sharing. We are, as an organization, and I think the table would agree, we have needed to get to some of the difficult decisions we're bringing before you during this season. But there's no question they're difficult decisions. They don't apply equally to everyone. I don't think they apply equally around the table. Not easy work for us. I respect the comments the trustee has made.
Madam Chair, I don't have too much to add to that, and it is not because I am without sympathy for some of the situations, especially in your zone. But when we're dealing with the facilities, it's not that one zone over another took a harder hit because of a zone. It took some significant change in some areas just because of where your schools are, the sizes of those schools, and how many kids there were in it. The overarching principle to make each school have equity of access to program meant that we were looking at boundaries that didn't respect zones. They fell outside of your zone and into another. And indeed, everything we do has a domino effect through this district. And so there are some areas, yours in particular is difficult. Alta Vista and Elmvale Acres was a very difficult area to reconcile. There are a few others, but by and large, those were, I think, the most challenging that we had in this district. And it was not that any particular area was targeted. It was trying to deal with the schools you had and balancing out and offering programs in as many schools as we could.
Continuing with that narrative that is out there, which we absolutely need to address. And again, it was a comment that was made. Knowing your child's cohort is the only one that has to make that sacrifice. Isn't that worth a change? And when I see the comments coming in on how many, the different configuration, how it's impacting families, are we telling our families, too bad, so sad? It's suck it up, because this is how my community is feeling right now.
Right. I understand that, Madam Chair, through you. We want to hear every comment that is had with this. We want to look at every comment and every suggestion. It is not, when I say that it's very difficult to change this plan, I am not saying that we will not, but I think the amount of change we can affect is somewhat scoped. That doesn't mean I don't want to hear about it, and it does not mean that we as parents ourselves, I mean, we remember what it was like, that 10-minute window. You had to have kids ready and out the door to wherever. And so the splitting of siblings is something that is very concerning, but it is something that we have tried to take into account and looked at the longer-term objectives of this particular study, and hope that this transitional year will give us time to make sure that the families and the students who are impacted by change can really be supported and tracked through all of this. So again, we know that there are compromises that had to be made to make the plan achieve as many of the objectives as we could. And we are concerned about those too, but we hope we can find different manners in which to address those concerns.
Trustee Nash, can I add you back to the second time speakers list? All right, continuing down my speakers list, I have Trustee Dixon, then Trustee Jennings, then Trustee Presley.
Through you, Chair, I wanted to echo what Trustee Scott said and also what Trustee Nash has said. And I guess it's more to do with the siblings having to be split, i.e. junior K with grade 3. And because there's some parents that do depend on EDP, and that's part of that. And now they're going to be separated, and there's a great concern in how they're going to be. They won't be, with the bell at 3 o'clock. Some parents are feeling that there's no way now for them to be able to keep a job. Right? So that was one concern. And then the other concern that I also heard was the fact that some will have to change to 3 different schools. Right? So, you know, we're going back to community schooling, but at the same time, we're asking, you know, to be shifted 3 different times. So, you know, how do we address that? And have we really thought about that?
Through you, Madam Chair, a comment on the second part, and then I'll turn over again to the manager. For the Board of Trustees, it's important to keep in mind that 6,000 to 8,000 of our students move every year right now anyway. We do have, without question, a one-year bump to about 11,000 students, as General Manager Ostafchuk pointed out. But right now, that's commonplace and is probably larger than it should be because our school configurations are JK to 3, JK to 4, JK to 5, JK to 6, 4 to 8, 5 to 8, 6 to 8, 7 to 8, JK to 8, 7 to 12. That's part of what we're looking to address here, is to reduce those number of configurations, keep cohorts of kids together, and cohorts, even in this one-time movement, will move together with one another, and then establish the kind of consistency in the move from elementary through to secondary, understanding that there's no one student in this district that will be in one site from JK through to grade 12. There's going to be movement anyway, no matter what. We're looking to make a one-time adjustment to then have stability, greater stability and predictability from there on for all students in cohorts moving from elementary to secondary. I'll turn it over to the General Manager if there's any other comment, be it for the childcare piece or the JK to 3, 4 to 8 commentary.
Madam Chair, I think I'd be being redundant at this point to go over it again.
Is that everything, Trustee Dixon? Okay, thank you. Going down, Trustee Jennings.
Thank you, Chair. We've certainly shared a number of themes that have been used throughout this elementary program review, like community. We've heard equity of access to programs, better programming. You know, we want a robust school, and we want, you know, to balance out our students across and have access to all of these programs. And yet our rural communities are speaking loudly as well because they feel strongly about their communities. And although tonight is more about overarching for all of the zones, in my zone, we have Osgood Public School, Pastor Valley Public School that already are dual track. They, so there's no changes to those programming, and yet they're being, you know, switched around. And of course, we have Greeley Public School. And if you could just speak to the reasoning behind the unique boundaries for Greeley Public School, and why now is Osgood, you know, why are we directing and transferring out students between Osgood and Castro Valley?
Madam Chair, I'll try and speak to some of the specifics. Hopefully when I do so, those of you who do not know Osgood, as well as I may have, having worked there for a number of years, you'll know what I'm talking about. Greeley Public School is really small. And when I look at the number of kids who live in Greeley and would say they identify as living in Greeley, there's about 1,000 of them, and the school holds 257 kids. So obviously, Greeley Public School cannot possibly hold all of the kids who identify as coming from Greeley or those developments along Mitch Owens Road. And so decisions had to be made about that particular boundary. And so to dual track that school, because the alternative would be to leave Greeley as the only English school in this entire district. In order to dual track it, you have to take some French kids from some place. That place is Castro Valley. So it has impacts to its boundary to add to Greeley Public School. And the boundary is tightened up so that both French and English from the old village itself can be made viable at that smaller facility. And then we're leaving a good deal of the land around it, actually either side of Greeley Public School, to continue to go to Castro Valley as it has done. Some of them actually former English students at Greeley will be going to Castro Valley. When it comes to Osgood, again, there are some definitions of community that are difficult to reconcile from a boundary standpoint. We were trying to balance out Osgood, Metcalfe, Castro Valley, and Greeley. All of them with different sizes and different facility attributes. When it came to Osgood Public School, we made the decision a number of years ago to dual track that school from a single track English school, and that's done very well, and it's quite balanced. The boundary around Osgood was a fairly nice, neat rectangle until you got what we referred to earlier as a panhandle going up River Road. And when you've got that, it's something that we wanted to straighten out with Castor Valley and regularize, if you will, that boundary. I know that some people will define community often where their kids play hockey. We often will joke that it's wherever your LCBO is. Where do you shop for groceries? That's how you identify the community. And I know that area really, really well. And I do know a number of them come to Osgood Village for those services. But I know equal numbers of them go all the way up River Road into the urban area. So when it came time to try and straighten out that boundary, we felt that that panhandle should be dealt with at that point in time. So that's Osgood.
Thank you for that. And as Trustee Lyra shared earlier, there will be instances where, a student will be at a school for 1 year and be flipping back and forth. Will you take into consideration over the next couple of years, perhaps when those come to fruition where we realize that these oddities, will you take that into consideration?
I think for a number of the oddities, we are aware of them and are hoping that those students can be supported regardless of where they go to school. For us to straighten them all out is a really complex thing to do, and I don't know that we can do that. Sometimes those changes are, as Director Buffoni has said, they will move with a cohort that they know and know well. There are some geographic changes that do mean that the whole cohort will not move, but we are hoping that those students will be supported in those schools just by the means of us taking that extra year for implementation and knowing what is to come.
Thank you. And of course, in our rural neighborhoods, public transit is not an option. So they will be relying on, our yellow buses to ensure that their students get to school timely. And if there is, several siblings at different schools, it's going to be really chaotic for our families. And there was also questions, on the quality of instruction now that we're adding in more dual track across the board. How are we going to ensure that our students receive quality of instruction? And perhaps that's not a planning department question. Perhaps the director could speak to that.
Sure. Through you, Madam Chair, I think as challenging as this process is, I think it provides staff the opportunity not only to refresh the resources, but working through both learning support services in Kate and program services in Reg and Marva, that we refresh our approach to teaching and learning. There'll be a greater synergy across the system with every school essentially offering the same programs, that we can build on the momentum of that, the alignment and coherence, not only of our unified shared goals, but also the resources we have in our schools as opposed to what we've got now in some of the slides that General Manager Ostafichuk brought forward. That second April report at Committee of the Whole, not the 8th of April, but the 22nd, staff will look to bring elements of detail, not in its entirety, because we do need the year to ensure we've mapped it out fully, but some examples for the Board of Trustees to see the kind of synergy we're looking to build on a pedagogical front. And it's not lost on me that our learning has stagnated. We are doing way too much, way too thin, and we've got to do less better. And that is part of our pedagogical strategic approach to all of this. And I know that's not the topic of this evening, but it does go hand in hand with simplifying over time what we're doing here in an infrastructural plan.
Thank you, Director. And just one last comment more, I guess. We've certainly heard a lot about mental health and perhaps the disruptive the change that will occur with this new program, new boundaries. what will the board, their district provide to families perhaps in terms of the mental health?
Through you, Madam Chair, what I can say on that front, and I've received some emails of that nature, you know, this is going to have a detrimental effect. What I do look at is what's going on right now. The kind of movement we have as an organization with 6,000 to 8,000 students moving every year anywhere without making a single change. And that's a part of our process. It's a part of life that you change schools, you adapt to new settings. I think there's some healthy elements to that. And I appreciate this one's not one in the natural flow. It's one that staff's bringing before the organization to make that change. What I am confident in saying is that not only in the pedagogical strategic pieces we're looking to refresh, we're also looking to continue our work in mental health and wellness across the system, and that I'm very confident that our educators will have an even steadier hand on our students through this difficult process. We are in this together as an organization, all interest holders and all members of staff, and I'm not worried about the kind of dedication and diligence that our employees will put in to see this through.
All right, thank you, Trustee Jenkins, Trustee Presley, then Trustee Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, I just want to confirm everyone can hear me as we had some audio issues earlier. Thank you very much. I'm just looking for pretty easy breezy, quick yes and no answers if they're able to be provided. I just want to confirm that on April 22nd, we will get a report that relates to a little bit more details in transportation areas as well as EDP and maybe some other elements that trustees may be considering in part of the review. Is this correct?
Yes.
And then we would then be voting on the EPR as a whole on April 29th, correct?
Correct.
So that, if I'm doing the math correctly, that would then give trustees 5 business days of being in receipt of all materials we would need to make this decision. I just wanted to make that, make sure I was doing the math correctly on that. I have some concerns with only having 5 days to make a well-informed decision on the fate of so many of our students. Thank you.
Through you, Madam Chair, I appreciate your comment, Trustee Presley. What staff will look to do is to bring the recommendation forward on April 8th, giving the Board of Trustees 3 weeks to contemplate, consider for a final approval on April 29th. So that's a 3-week period. That preliminary report will have as much detail as staff can provide, both for the recommendations for the boards to consider and any operational details. What I'm saying to the Board of Trustees is that I know there are some other detailed pieces that may be of interest should the recommendation be approved that we'll bring forward on the 22nd as additional detail. But in a long-winded way to answer your question, Trustee Presley, that the vast majority of what you'll need to make a decision will be available on April 8th. I'm not excluding that we'll utilize April 22nd to provide any additional detail in the beginning of a transition implementation plan. And again, I say with all respect, not putting the cart before the horse. We understand a decision would need to be made, but I have had some questions from trustees and others about how we would do various elements. We want to bring some of that forward to the Board of Trustees without it interfering so much operationally with the essence of a recommendation that we'll bring 3 weeks in advance. Sorry for the lack of clarification on that.
No, I appreciate the answer, and I would just like to convey that my utmost respect and thanks to staff for the extensive amount of work that they've been putting into this. I felt it would be correct to just put that out for everyone. That, you know, timelines are getting a little bit shorter, and I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions around the room. So I just felt I would be doing a disservice to my community members if I didn't bring that up. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Trustee Presley. Trustee Lee.
Thanks. So the question I'll ask can be applied broadly. Having had some civil engineering experience and looking at the maps and the data that you had, I can make my own assumptions on why certain boundaries were drawn, but I'll kind of ask it to you so I don't make assumptions of what you were thinking. Where schools are fairly close together, thinking about, like you were saying, the Alta Vista and kind of down into the Greenboro Hind Club area, where basically schools are just on the other side of the road from each other. How did you make the decision of which school got which grade configuration? And if you need an example, Bondar and Bateman being literally a couple hundred feet or a couple hundred meters across from each other, but just on the other side of a major road.
Madam Chair, through you, that's a good example of an area where we had challenges. Dunlop, Bateman, and Bondar are very, very close together. There is some surplus space, and there are fewer students. And so in order to make those decisions, we did try everywhere we could. It wasn't successful across the district, but we looked everywhere we could when we had to split up different grades to put those intermediate students where we had intermediate facilities. And that, I think, was part of the rationale in that area. Trust that answers that.
All right, and I'm getting a thumbs up from Trustee Lee. So we are going to go to Trustee Bell, and then we will do our community partners. Trustee Bell.
Great, thanks everyone. Good evening. A lot of the issues that I wanted to raise have already been raised. I do also want to echo what Trustee Lyra has brought up with regards to grandparenting, and what Trustee Dixon has mentioned. In 3 moves in 3 years or 4 years is going to be a lot for students. And so just flagging that, I hope we can run the numbers to see what it would look like with grandparenting. I know that there's been a lot of work, so I'm very grateful to staff. The Centertown community is very complex, specifically Somerset. There's a lot of schools that are pretty close by. And there's been communities that have been made over the years. And I think this is an opportunity to look at how you can shift and be inclusive within our community. So I want to thank the planners for working hard to make that happen. There are, however, some dangers in Centertown, including roads such as Bronson and Booth that now with the new configuration students will have to cross where there currently are no crossing guards. And so I'm hopeful that someone can speak to that and what will happen when there are dangers and what we are thinking and planning on that front. Also in Centertown, we know that there's a lot of housing developments that are on the horizon, and we're talking about from the 5 to 10 year range. And so before we set things in stone when it comes to boundaries, I'm wondering if it would be possible to take another look with projections that have already been provided by the city with regard to the numbers of potential families that will be joining our community over the next 5 to 10 years. Those are my questions for right now. Thanks.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll tackle the first one, then turn it over to General Manager Ostafchuk for a comment on the data utilized in terms of projections. We will look over the course of the upcoming school year to have school counselors, school communities engaged in any elements of new configurations and how we can solidify, strengthen the homeschool partnership, whether that's walking to school, crossing guards, monitors, et cetera, as new configurations begin to be planned and into place. So I think Trustee Bell raises a really great point. That's a value, and as ultimately with any recommendations that are approved, we'll begin work right away, really in May and June in that kind of transition implementation planning. Many of the elements that Trustee Bell mentioned would be a part of that, and a part of getting input from school communities on how we can see that through successfully. I'll turn it over to the General Manager.
Madam Chair, Trustee Bell's zone was another area that was a challenge, and I'll just, you've got, Cambridge, Centennial, certainly implications from Devonshire, even though it's not in that area. What we had to look at, because you've had schools that were, again, English only, French immersion only, in order to balance out new boundaries where both programs were available at all schools, we had to look at some of the orientations of those boundaries. I think in your area, I think it's fair to say that north-south orientations to those boundaries is what we'd had in the past for our schools. And when it came to balancing out the numbers, we couldn't maintain that. So we had to go east-west with the boundaries to make sure that each school was sustainable. And as you pointed out, that boundary is transected by Bronson Avenue, and that was not without concern. We've certainly flagged that to OSTA going forward. It may be considered a hazard depending on what grade your child is in. Right now, we do have a number of kids who today cross Bronson for MFI purposes. So those are older children, I recognize that, but that's certainly taken into account. And when you live in Centertown, you have streets of that nature. And so we'll certainly be looking over that year of implementation to look to whether or not those children would be bused, or whether or not there is some intervention with the City of Ottawa that we can confirm for them. So absolutely looking to that.
Great.
so
And then
the
I guess the last part was, yeah, there was a question about reviewing the boundaries with a perspective of 5 to 10 year plan.
And we absolutely did that already. It's not like we have to go back and do that. We work with the City of Ottawa every day in knowing what developments are not only on the books, but proposed, where there is capability for infill within those areas. It's not just what is an active site plan of subdivision development proposal. We know what the capability is for infill and growth within that community. I can tell you that we have taken those carefully into account. However, we are working with the facilities we've got also. And so we are trying to balance those facilities out as best we can now, and hopefully that will speak well into the future. As I said, we're trying to, as best we can, leave a bit of room at each school so we have some flexibility both for the school's use itself and for growth if that occurs.
Okay, thank you very much through you, Chair. Just a couple other points. I just want to say to the public that every school in Zone 10 in Somerset is an incredible school, already with flourishing communities, and I think we can only benefit from making greater linkages. That being said, schools will have to be retrofitted to make this happen, and so there will be a cost to our board, and I am very much looking forward to understanding when that work will be done, hopefully before students move, so that the transition can be as smooth as possible. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Trustee Bell. So we're going to go to Jameson and Anthony, and then we're going to call a break. So Jameson, please go ahead.
Thank you, everyone. Again, I'm the union rep for occasional teachers. So the implications to this, my members move around quite a bit. So there's not so much. I'm looking at this overview wise as a member of the public. And I suggested last time maybe having some opportunities for staff, the thought exchange idea of getting feedback on this. And again, just maybe a suggestion, the boundary maps, you can put in a street address and find a school locator now. I'm a visual person, visual learners. It might make sense to have a map that's on the Engage website where someone can just roll their mouse over an area and see these boundaries visually, so we can see what's next to and what's going to. Because I think there's a lot of questions out there and a lot of anxiety about not knowing where exactly, if my neighbor, if my babysitter is now in a new catchment area, you know, do I need that aspect for parents? So that's the one piece. Second piece I wanted to ask, particularly and generally, was I noticed that all the intermediate school sites are over 100% capacity. Was that a planning consideration for the secondary school review that's coming, or was that what was their intention to that?
Madam Chair, through you, there was, first of all, we don't have a secondary review scheduled, so there is no intent there. A number of those schools are phasing in or phasing out. A lot of them, when you get to the intermediate schools, will have MFI programs. And so some of that initial high number, and if I may, those numbers aren't extraordinarily high. We think the schools are nicely filled and are manageable, all of them. We've looked at that, and a lot of that is attributable to MFI phasing out over years, and we think there'll be greater stability once that happens.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll only add to General Manager Ostfachuk's comments that we have some scheduled staff sessions open to all staff, both permanent and occasional, across March, the 6th, 17th, and 24th, 2 in person, 1 virtual, for staff input, in addition to the Engaged OCDSB platform for staff to put comments in. And what's really helpful with that is we can then analyze some of the comments, come prepared for those staff sessions to be able to answer at least trends of questions. So staff sessions are available.
Thank you. And final question would be current closed sites, Century Public School, DA Moody. Did that fit into any planning of reopening space, sites like that or catchments for those?
No, it did not. And the reason for that is we have certainly a surplus of pupil places as it is. There was no site that would be more advantageous geographically. And so absolutely not. We did not consider those sites. If they're closed, and the district moves around it.
All right, thank you very much. Moving on the speakers list. So Anthony, please go ahead.
Through you, the chair. I have 5 key themes I would like to get through quickly. First, for the alternative programs. Students have, to my understanding, studied in cohorts of multiple grade years together. And now with alternative being phased out, children in the new elementary program review design who have progressed at speeds that do not focus on the provincial curriculum standardized speeds, they may still need to feel included when many of their peers may have moved on as a cohort. So how to mitigate the sense of belonging for the key objective of inclusiveness, and this in the context of the original benefits of the original elementary alternative program.
Through you, Madam Chair, very briefly, Anthony, appreciate the comment. Right now, 35 to 45% of our sites overall have multi-grade classrooms on a regular basis. Schools, alternative or other, have groupings, activities. I was at Taylor and Cassidy earlier this school year on one of my visits, and I can't remember exactly what it's called, but they have duck groupings. They have kids come together across multiple grades. It's fairly commonplace at a tenant that will continue to look to and aspire to promote moving forward. That won't change because that's a common approach in having multi-aged, multi-grade classes. Also, I have to say, in a single grade class, it's, it won't be a surprise to anyone that the learning profiles, the readiness levels, the interests, the passions of our students are already diversified. So it is somewhat of a fictitious construct because the wonderful diversity of our learners is already spreading well beyond grade structures itself into interests and, again, knowledge, skills, readiness, et cetera. So something we're confident we'll be able to address in the move forward.
Okay. So I'm trying to understand. So this in the new program, the student will be in a classroom with kids of different grades?
Potentially. They might be in a straight grade class. They might be in a combination grade class. Depends on the population of the school, the grade configurations, the allocation or interest of which program parents, guardians, and caregivers put their children. Depends on a number of factors, but ultimately, yes, they might be, they might not be.
Okay, and that's for new, not for the children that are grandparented in, but the children that are new. All right, thank you. And then, what are the key performance issues of concern that have been identified that need to be managed in general that it would be helpful to have a table in which the latest teaching models and other resolutions that have been adopted in the elementary program review being mapped onto a solution so that the community can be reassured that the alternative programs is being transitioned in good hands. As much as it is about good management, it's about good stakeholder communication. I think because for the parents and new parents that are losing this program. It's about having, knowing that this is, it's being replaced with something that's a solid.
No question, Anthony, through you, Madam Chair. We are looking to consolidate programming to do less better. We feel on balance the offering of a dual track option across the city is something no other district in this province offers. We're not looking at a lottery system. We're not asking people to line up early on a Saturday morning to get into a program. We're looking at providing every single student across the district the opportunity to study in a dynamic bilingual setting with students who are in the English program and the French immersion programming, crossing over and working together in subjects that are taught under a common language. That's the vision, that's the aspiration we're looking at to get to, and not creating inequities by having students bypass schools to get to various programs or not offer it at all, or quite frankly, not even be aware of what the options might be. So all to say, yes, we're looking at continuing to map learning and wellness over time by doing less better and really honing in and focusing on the learning environment. The board and the public will see that in our approach to the budget moving forward in this upcoming school year as well. Our focus needs to be on learning and on wellness moving forward and reducing the number of inefficient and ineffective structures that get in the way of allocating our resources optimally to both of those things.
Thank you. And then I think, and what I was trying to also emphasize is it's about communicating, like having, like, for example, visually, like, or be able to communicate to the stakeholders what's being replaced in terms of for the alternative program, that like how good the alternative programs were, and then what's being replaced in terms of being replaced on the other hand with the new program there. And then what are the foreseen and potential special challenges with
Anthony,
maybe second time.
Anthony, you are out of time, so I can put you on the second time speakers list for all of the questions for the alternative program. Staff can get back to you with an answer, and they're taking under advisement the suggestion of a table. So we will follow up. With that said, I'm going to call a break, and I'm going to ask everyone to please be back here by 9:50. 9:15. 9:15.
Anthony, you might want to mute your microphone.
their seats, we're going to get started.
Lynn,
All right, I am seeing quorum in the room, so I am going to call the meeting back to order. So we are going to go through, we are entering second time speakers list. So it will be Trustee Scott, then Trustee Kaplan-Myrth, then Trustee Lyra, then Trustee Nash. And then I will be going through, and then we're going to go to community partners. So Trustee Scott, please go ahead.
Thank you. Given the time and given the quality of discussion so far on this item, I think we are going to need more time this evening. And therefore, I'm wondering whether it would be in order to move to place the notice of motion at 9.1 and the report on the update on student learning and well-being, report 25-015 on a future agenda rather than keeping staff here to try to deal with them tonight. I think that would still leave us enough time to receive the reports from other committees and so on, but it would give us more time for the discussion we're having on the EPR report. So would it be in order to move to refer those two items, 9.1 and 10.1, to a future meeting to be determined?
Yes, that would be in order. So we are going to vote on the motion, and then we will return to Trustee Scott's speaking time. So just to be clear on what we're voting on, we are voting on deferring items 9.1 and 10.1 to a future meeting, and it will be brought to agenda planning. We'll let everyone know what meeting that will be referred to. Does anyone need clarification on what we're voting on right now? No? Okay, so I'm going to call the vote. All those in favor of deferring the notice of motion and the report? And that carries. All right, thank you very much, everyone. Trustee Scott, your speaking time is continuing, so please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm just wondering from the point of view of the rural communities, where in some cases we have some interesting geographic challenges and school size challenges relative to where the population centers actually are. What I'm wondering is whether there is a really hard and fast reason for sticking to the every school a dual track school if at all possible. If in fact for a community, it might be a better solution and a more workable solution in the longer term, at least, or to retain existing situations. For example, I have some very successful English-only schools in my zone, and some of the facilities are not well sized or would need significant alterations if we changed the grade configuration or tried to modify the program too much.
Madam Chair, we did take that into account somewhat. Certainly the rural area could be more of a challenge, and there was less flexibility because you have some, as you said, big schools and tucked up at one corner of a community, smaller schools interspersed. It's a difficult challenge. On balance, and you're quite right, there are some areas where there are some very successful single-track schools. I don't know if they're always going to be successful single-track schools going into the future. That's the neat thing about planning. There's always some change to make. And so I think what we were really striving for is that equity of choice. And so we wanted to make sure that across the district, wherever it was feasible, they had that choice. And it did mean for making some difficult decisions in some of the rural areas. In others, it was more straightforward. But again, that I think was the driving factor behind the decisions that were made and really not knowing what's to come. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
All right, thank you, Trustee Scott. Trustee Kaplan-Murphy.
Thank you through your chair. I'm going to keep going through my questions for my constituents. So my next question concerns accessibility. This question is around much more remaining a French immersion center. And the question is that people who would most benefit from the program additions, for example, those who currently travel the furthest from the school, are those in the district who live west of Bronson in the Glebe Annex, which are also the people who are probably less socioeconomically advantaged in the Glebe. And they're currently having to travel all the way to First Ave. And yet we haven't, and in our projections, much more will be under enrolled. And we're not adding English to much more. We're keeping it as only French. So the question is, underlying principles of increasing accessibility and offering English and French programming to all students aren't being met. Why is that? And then I have more questions.
Madam Chair, with much more, and I'll try and be concise with the answers. We took some of that population, that French immersion population, to ensure that First Avenue could be dual tracked. That accounted for its change in enrollment. But when that was one of the areas, one of the 4 areas where we had a really strong look at the English numbers and felt that 2 English programs were not sustainable. So we couldn't look at First and much more with English and really look ourselves in the mirror and say that that English program was going to be robust enough to sustain. So it was decided that much more would be one of the 4 FI centers in the district.
Thank you for that. I think that, okay, I'm going to go on to my next question. The next question concerns disruptions in community-based learning and splitting of families with multiple kids. So Alta Vista, as well as Glebe, Old Ottawa South, and Old Ottawa East residents have all expressed concern. This is actually links to what Trustee Nash was saying as well. Maybe a suburban model of busing seems to have been juxtaposed on urban communities. So we have kids who were used to, and families who are used to walking to school, who are going to suddenly have to put their children on buses. The proposed K-3, 4-8 split in Alta Vista and the boundary changes at Hopewell and Lady Evelyn create significant logistical challenges for working families, siblings attending different schools in opposite directions, different school time starts. After school arrangements become more complex, older siblings can't help younger ones with transportation and care, and also the environmental impact of suddenly requiring young children to commute 3 times further to school, where in the past parents were within walking distance with their children. So how are we going to address that? And then
Madam Chair, I'll start. I don't know if Director Buffoni has anything to add to it. Again, Alta Vista, as I've noted, is in particular one of the most challenging areas that we had, with so many surplus pupil places and such disparity in school size. We had some very large schools, some very, very small schools. In order to try and keep all those schools, keep them robust, really that grade configuration change was the only idea that we had in order to keep those schools viable. In doing so, again, I acknowledge we've got some sibling issues, and I hope that the year between decision and implementation will give us some ideas and some solutions to support families going through this, especially when it comes to childcare. I understand, as I said, as a parent, and knowing that you have that 10-minute time frame in order to execute that ballet that is getting kids out the door in the morning. I understand how challenging it is, and we're not trying to minimize that, but I have no other solution to utilization at schools.
Okay, thank you. Another question that was raised by Alta Vista parents is in terms of the boundary decisions, didn't look at natural community divisions, family impacts and safety, but they give examples of roads and I've committed to walk all of these streets myself, but the proposed boundaries for Pleasant Park exclude some areas which would have been closer to Riverview Park East, half the distance and more walkable. And on the same side of Smythe Road, I think that there are a bunch of questions around safety, particularly because the new boundaries create distances that are unsafe to walk for many kids, and neighborhood connections are being severed instead of strengthened. So I'll go back on the list because I've got a couple more questions. Thank you.
I think staff are taking note and will respond after your next round of questions. For going down the speakers list, I have Trustee Lyra, then Trustee Nash.
Thanks. I think it was the third bullet of the first or second slide where it was the things that the district review intended to do was to ensure that no school was set up for failure. One of the concerns that has been raised about my zone in particular is that Robert E. Wilson is being set up for failure. Right now, more than half, it's currently an English-only school. It's a small school, and it's a bit of a school with a reputation in need of some love. It is, right now, more than half of the students are from the English program are being proposed to be moved to Manor Park, which necessitates grandfathering the grade 6 class. And I am concerned that because the boundaries for Robert E. Wilson are so small, that when, like over the next number of years, it is going to be the school in my zone that struggles the most. It is right in the middle of Vanier. It is right in the middle of our highest socioeconomic needs neighborhood. And I'm concerned that if the ministry said you have to start closing schools, it is going to be the one on the chopping block because it is going to be the most under-enrolled in the area. It has the smallest neighborhood, or it has the smallest catchment area, and therefore it is the neighborhood that is, or the school that is most likely to be unable to advocate for itself in the future. And so if one of the premises of this is not to set a school up to fail, I have real concerns about where Robert E. Wilson landed. And I'd love a staff comment on this.
Madam Chair, we struggled with R.E. Wilson. I'll be honest with you. Certainly, we looked at Vanier and what we could do with the school. It's a really small school, and it doesn't have any portable capability. Let me rephrase that. It does if you crane it over the school. There's no way to get a portable in the back. So when you've got a school with 275 pupil places, you want to be sure that everybody fits in that building when you've got no alternative, because if that population burgeons in any way, you're moving kids through an accommodation review. So we look very carefully. You've got 275 pupil places, as I said, at R.E. Wilson. K-3, if I look at North and South Vanier, I've got 300 kids right now. Doesn't fit, no portables. That's why we did what we did with R.E. Wilson. And not only that, it does have implications for where they feed to and how they feed, and whether or not a school like Queenie is going to be sustainable over time. If you are trying to straighten out those feeds, then including North Vanier in that also breaks up that feed, and other schools become unsustainable. So we've tried to look really hard at those areas, and even though the enrollment goes down slightly, given the proposal, I think there are enough kids and enough development infill there to account for R.E. Wilson being robust. As a matter of fact, in that boundary, just so you know, we've gone from 159 to 184 to 205. Like the numbers of kids are increasing every year. So there is some renewal there. I want to be prudent with what we put into it. North and South Vanier already burst it at the seams. So that's why it is what it is.
I see. Okay. What can we do to reassure that school community that it is safe despite its low enrollment and despite its less than ability to advocate for itself in the near future?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, there's a moratorium on school closure, and there's absolutely no thought that that's going to change anytime soon. And I mean, if it was going to change, I think we would have reconciled the number of surplus pupil places that we have district-wide in different ways. So no school is being set up to close. No school is being set up to be less than successful. And I guess that's really all you can say to them. I'm happy to talk to anyone from that community who may be interested about why we did what we did. And really it came down to numbers and the capacity at that school. When we only have a handful of schools in this district where there's absolutely no portable capability, and they are a continual challenge to us.
Okay. I do have a couple of like catchment area questions. I think those are better dealt with when you and I can see the same map. So I'm going to hold off from that because trying to describe the cluster of 6 streets that might be better off in a different catchment is going to be real tough without a map. So I'm going to hold, I do have questions about catchments that I have heard around Manor Park and Rockcliffe Park boundary. I've heard from people about Viscount and Lady Evelyn's boundary, and I've heard from people about Queen Elizabeth's boundary. And so those are the 3-4 schools that I'd like to talk with you about in the future. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Trustee Lyra. Trustee Nash?
Yes, and thank you, and through you, Chair. Back in 2017, it was my understanding that the board worked on, again, looking at configurations and with pedagogy and so forth. There was a very strong consensus that senior kindergarten, to grade 8 was the preferred configuration. Can you speak to that? And also, again, in conjunction with Severn and Woodruff, obviously, particularly with Severn, you and we had that discussion about increasing it to 7-8 because we were looking at the numbers, and it's a very vibrant community. And clearly Woodruff is already SK to 8. I'll just leave it at that.
Certainly, I don't think there's any doubt that fewer transitions is a desirable thing. And I don't think K-8 was ever touted as the configuration. But certainly there was a preference stated for K-8s feeding to 9-12s and K-6s feeding to 7-12s, wherever that was possible. And again, I don't mean to be repetitive, but I've got to go back to the fact that I was tasked to make every school as viable as I could. And we have some real have schools and some have not schools right now in terms of not only program, but in terms of enrollment that pretty much fit on a yellow bus. And so if I was to balance those things out, the only way in which to do that and have viable grades within that school doesn't fill up the school any better, but the grades themselves are more robust, was to change that grade configuration. I can tell you that that was not only a planning decision. We discussed long and hard what was the best thing to do in these cases. And although I don't think anybody's backtracking on the ideal configurations that we'd like to have, when you can't do that sort of thing district-wide, and you have some schools that really do need attention because of very, very fragile low enrollments, you do what you can to balance it out. So.
Thank you. In relation to Regina, because right now it's in the proposal you're talking about making it the SK to grade 3, and actually Regina is the continuum of the alternative program, and is that one thought is perhaps, I know a lot of the alternative children come with vans or their transportation, particularly Regina location. Any thought perhaps of moving those children to Churchill? Because I know there's capacity there, and making Regina SK to 6 a community school. Thank you.
Madam Chair, through you, we certainly looked at that sort of thing. The objective, though, was to start to phase out both MFI and ALT where they were. Whether or not we would look in the future to consolidate as the grades aged out, That may be the case, but the direction was to age them out where they are. Churchill, ironically, is one of those sites that is one of the ones that can't take a portable. And so again, we're very, very mindful of what capacity that school has. To consolidate both programs under one roof would mean that Churchill's transformation into a dual-track community school could not occur for some years to come. And that would mean when that happened, there would be more disruption to the schools around Churchill in order to create that boundary. So those things were considered, absolutely. You know, we didn't take lightly the renovations done at Woodruff and the capability of that school, or looking to Regina and what it could be capable of. But when we looked at the number of children in that catchment and how filled each classroom would be, we had some serious concerns. And so therefore, that's the configuration that we've recommended.
Thank you. And as Trustee Lyra mentioned, I also have a number of schools which are where the boundaries are changing and where families have concerns, primarily, obviously, Denvenshire, we've spoken, Elmdale and Broadview. So I'll be speaking with you on those. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Trustee Nash. I am going to pass the chair to Trustee Jenkins, please, because I have a couple of questions.
Go ahead.
All right, so I'm going to start with what I'm hoping is a few quick questions. So I just want to confirm that the special education is not highlighted in this report because the boundaries of these classes are independent from the school catchment area. And my question with that is, given the proposed boundaries, if the 39 special education programs were to continue, what impact would it have on the elementary program review?
From my standpoint, none that I can think of. As far as room at each school being my primary concern, there seems to be adequate flexibility. That has been planning's concern, I think.
Go ahead.
All right, and then the second question I have is, can we assume that one of the benefits of this review is a reduction in portables across the district? I'm hoping that's an easy question.
There is a better balance of portables across the district, yes. I have to tell you that portables will never be eliminated. It used to make me nuts when I worked municipally, the building permits that came in at the very last minute for portables, wondering why I didn't understand how people couldn't count, especially brand new schools where portables were required pretty much from the very first year it opened. So you're going to see portables in the growth areas, particularly the South Urban Community, Canada, you know, Riverside South. Those are the communities where you're going to see those portables still very much in use. But generally speaking, especially with the creation of the new Orleans Elementary School, you're going to see a reduction, particularly in your area, as a matter of fact, of portable use. So we're not eliminating them. They're still required here and there. For the phase in, phase out, where we saw those little blips that I spoke of, they're still probably going to be in use temporarily, but it should take the pressure off some of it.
All right, thank you. And my next question is, I just want to confirm, I understand that there is an additional, we'll call it report, or information coming forward to us on April 8th and 22nd. Can you confirm if information on the schools that are currently configured for kindergarten to grade 8, if they're slated to transition to 4 to 8, what some form of a high-level renovation plan is, or what the plan is for those schools?
Through you, Madam Chair, that's the intent of the report on April 27th. I want to make clear to the Board of Trustees, the vast majority of the information that you'll need to make a decision will be there on April 8th. But there have been questions around various aspects of the transition. I also want to make clear that that won't be a comprehensive, perfect plan that has every single transition implementation thought fully planned out. We're taking the better part of a year and a half to make sure we see the transition through, because we'll need that time. All I'm signaling here is that there's been questions around elements of transition. We'll bring an oversight overview of those transition implementation elements in that report, but no, likely not a dollar for dollar comprehensive renovation plan. We'll take the time over the next number of months to sort that through, but we want to give you a sense of what we're working on around implementation should the recommendation be approved.
All right, and then similar to my colleagues, I am hearing a lot from my community, and there's a lot of concern around the Forest Valley and Henry Larson reconfiguration, and specifically not only splitting up siblings, but having students that did not require to walk to these schools before now having to either walk or bus. And I know we don't have the maps in front of us tonight, but I will be following up for some additional information. But I'm wondering if someone can provide some context of why these changes were made, because this is a very big blow to the community and a very big change for them.
Certainly, and certainly this community is impacted, but there are a number of others across the district where the same thing has happened. Just quickly, so it's a combination of Convent Glen, Forest Valley, and Henry Larson. You've got the impact of the new EUC school going in there as well, but the long and the short of it is there's just over 800 students and there's over 1,400 pupil places. So when you've got that situation, we've done K-3s, north and south at Convent Glen and Forest Valley, dual track them both, and they all feed to Henry Larson in a consistent feeding pattern. I understand once again where those combinations of schools have been created as part of this draft to look at. You know, you may be closer to home K-3, but you won't be 4 to 8 or vice versa. We understand that, and we understand the challenge that poses.
All right, so that actually leads perfectly into my final question. So I think a lot of great work has been done on the elementary program review, and I think there's a lot of excellent changes that are being proposed. But I do hear from parents, and I was at a parent council meeting last night, 2 nights ago, what is time at this point? But one of the things that the parents did say to me is, can we justify this change? And if the boundaries are changing for them and they switch to a different school board within Ottawa, can we justify that and can we live with that? So I'd like the director to respond, please.
Certainly, I will make a comment, and I've made this for a number of months throughout the period of early April of 2024 through to today. There hasn't been a single person that has said to me, Mr. Director, what are you talking about? You know, this is crazy. Why are you doing this? Up until the release of the report on Friday, just about every interaction I had, and some of them were critical interactions, spoke to the understanding and principle of what we're doing here. The 3 overarching principles, the kind of comprehensive program model put forward by staff. The issue has been since that even some of the emails I read today were, look, I believe in what you're doing in principle, but please don't do it in my neck of the woods. Don't do it in my area. Don't do it to my kids. Don't do it in my specific circumstance. And that's one of the challenges of this large, complex change management process. I will not discredit the concerns raised by parents, guardians, and caregivers. I know we are in for some short-term change management that we need to see through with a steady hand for a greater long-term stabilization. And then I will say, Trustee Milburn, that I'm really excited about the future of this district. We will be offering bilingual programming system-wide for any student, any parent, guardian, caregiver who wants it in every single school. That's the vision of this. We've got, no question, some challenges ahead of us to see a transition plan through, but the future is bright for the district, and I'm very confident and convinced that putting these into place and some of the changes that we see, and again, I'll remind everyone, we make changes every single school year to kids who go from one school to another in significant numbers, that we will have a bright future for the organization for every single student in terms of equity of access, experience, opportunity, and most important of all, outcome. That's what we're striving for.
That's it for questions. Chair, back to you.
All right, thank you. I'm continuing down my speakers list. So I have Stephen and then Anthony, and then I'm going to third-time speakers list.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. I just wanted to I think I've said this before, that, communities are built within our district as a whole and we could look and see that over the course of decades. Diverse communities of students, coming together with educators to learn and work together. And in some cases, that has meant more diversity when we do that. I just want to mention that. And I know many teachers have, even though they don't live in the community, have really given a lot over many years to that community, and wouldn't want to be anywhere else. So, I think some of what's been mentioned by previous speakers about constituents they've heard from is the same as what we're hearing from teachers, and they're kind of shocked and feel betrayed, and they are, many of them found out through CTV the details. I know I did the same. I printed it off, or I think actually Jameson printed them off for us in our office. So that too felt like it was a bit rushed, and that suddenly there's a lot of information coming forward. So teachers are in shock and wondering what they should do, reaching out to us and saying, what's staffing going to look like? Should I be thinking about this now, even though this isn't happening until 2026? So really what's at stake here, it's the community building that's been going on for decades, and it hurts when it's broken. So talking about movement of students, I'd like to talk about movement of teachers. Do we have any numbers on exactly how many elementary teachers will possibly be moving? I know we know 11,000 students, but I know it's hard to guess. But do we have any numbers on that?
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll turn it over to Superintendent Lehman for his perspective from Employee Services. I don't believe we have those specifics worked out yet, but I'll just ask the superintendent for a comment.
Through you, Chair. No, at this point in time, we don't have any specifics related to anticipated numbers of moves. Again, as we work through into the coming months, if we're moving forward with the program review, then we'll certainly be working with federations and unions around staff movement and processes, following collective agreements, obviously. As well, this is a bit different than things we've done in the past, right? Because there could be significant movement. So certainly we'll be working with the unions around a process that makes sense for our staff and students.
Thanks for that. I just want to highlight that in some of the schools that have had drastic changes, some of those teachers remaining in those schools or that are in those schools may not have the qualifications, or their grade level will no longer be reflected in that school. So they're really concerned about where they're going and how they're going to get to a place where they'll feel comfortable and can rebuild again.
Through you, Madam Chair, I appreciate Stephen's comments. That I don't discredit, along with the comments of parents, guardians, caregivers, the comments of our staff. This is, again, a large, complex change management process. Unfortunately, as staff, from a senior management perspective, and I would say we were not in a position to be able to roll out, a 9-part plan like this. We really had to put together, as General Manager Ostafchuk mentioned, as comprehensive a plan as we could, and then bring it forward to the Board of Trustees. We, through the Engage platform, welcome and look forward to comments of staff. We understand for some sites there'll be no change at all, or very minor change. For other sites, it'll be a complete makeover of that context, and we don't take that lightly. But we appreciate the poise and professionalism of our staff and look forward to working with Federation Union partners on various versions of what we might be able to do to see this kind of a process through that might be very much like what we do every single year for our positions that come available, but might be different. So from a senior staff perspective, as director, I will say, and I know I speak for Superintendent Lehman here, and Associate Director Reynolds and others, that we're open to conversations on how we can see this through as seamlessly as possible for our hardworking and diligent staff. So we look forward to those conversations.
Yeah, and just to, I think just to follow up on all of that, I know that, proposals come and go. And at the end of the day, teachers are really concerned about the cuts to services that have happened over the course of, I would say, 30 years or more. And that really is number one for teachers. And if that's, that's not being, if they're not feeling it's being addressed, then that's really what's at the root of their concern going forward. So I just want to stress that again. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much. Continuing down the speakers list, Anthony, please go ahead.
Okay, through you, the chair. What are the foreseen and or potential special challenges, risks, or opportunities when it comes to safety for special education needs for transportation with all the changes?
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll turn this over to Superintendent Stout in terms of safety risks around transportation for students in special needs who may be integrating back in the regular classroom, if I've understood the question clearly.
Thanks, Anthony, for the question. I'm not sure that anything would really be different from our current process at this time in terms of the evaluation of kind of the safety concerns and requirements, and if consideration may be given around specialized transportation. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I believe so. I was just thinking if with all the boundary changes and all the reorganization, if there were any special challenges ahead with that.
I think that we would continue to review and look at those situations on an individual basis as we currently do.
And Anthony, just before I hand it back over to you, just a reminder that the report in front of us is on the boundaries and grade configuration. All of the other elements for the elementary program review, the director would be happy to follow up with you on any of the questions you may have as well. You can go ahead.
So we've moved on basically.
The report that is in front of the board tonight is on boundaries and grade configuration. The elementary program review as a whole will be coming back for discussion on April 8th, but please don't quote me on that date.
Okay.
So if we can keep our questions focused on boundaries and grade configuration, that would be really appreciated.
All right, thank you. Okay, I'll pass on.
Anthony, do you have any further questions on boundaries and grade configuration?
No.
Okay. All right, perfect. Thank you very much for all the questions. So we're going to go to third time speakers list, Trustee Kaplan-Murphy and then Trustee Lyra.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. One of the questions that my constituents had is around the 4 to 8 model and whether there's any evidence through research and education, through best practices, that this is that creating these new boundaries and these new grade configurations is actually supported in terms of our pedagogy. And I would like to, I have more questions, but I'd like to know on what basis, because when we argue that we're looking for supports for students, inclusivity, and so on and so forth, we have, and communities, we have argued in the past that older children mentoring younger children is important. And we have talked in a special education context about the needs of some children who are not at the same developmental stage necessarily as their peers, having those supports through other grades, younger grades, but now we're dividing them. We've got K to 3, 4 to 8. So what happens to that inclusivity model?
Through you, Madam Chair, I think it's an excellent question, Trustee Kaplan-Murphy. I will say that regardless, how can I frame this? In spite of, regardless of the school grade configuration, what's most important in the research is the educator in front of the students. The other elements are far eclipsed by the interaction in the instructional core between the educator and student and whatever the task to be learned is. And so there are arguments to be made for a variety of grade configurations. Part of what I think General Manager Ostafchuk speaks to is that in order to ensure we are able to run dual track programming for all of our students in a healthy, viable way, we are best positioned in the JK to 3, for not always, there's JK to 6 and JK to 8, but that when we weighed the school grade configuration against the notion of having a wider grade configuration and then much weaker combinations of students in both enhanced English and French immersion, we landed on balancing all of those factors that this grade configuration wasn't going to be detrimental per se. I don't discredit the beautiful notion of a grade 7 student working in a grade 2 class. It's wonderful, but we did feel on balance pedagogically, in addition to the planning elements, that we would be able to coordinate our schools, our resources at the primary level, coordinate the kind of screening that we needed to do that wouldn't be detrimental for our learners. We're really excited that all of our schools, all of our sites will be great places to learn, accepting the fact that we still have 6th grade configurations, not 1 or 2, as mentioned, but that we're far better off than the 9 that we have now. But at the end of the day, the educator in front of the students is going to be the most important factor, regardless of the configuration. We think we can work with our configurations well and have a focus on learning and wellness.
Thank you. So that actually leads to my next question, which is around costs. Constituents have asked, what are the costs associated with the new boundaries and how will these be covered? And I guess I would add to that, if we have a $20 million deficit and we're being told we have to do less better, and we're saying that we're going to be more inclusive, and we haven't really heard from educators, we need to know from those teachers, how are they going to be able to actually be trained and supported in this model where we've now, we're asking them also to move schools and move programs. How are we gonna support them? How are we gonna know that teachers are gonna be able to say that this child is no longer someone else's problem? They have to take care of these children, whether they're dysregulated, whether they have special needs, whether they have, any other challenges that in the past might have been supported elsewhere. How are we going to do that?
Through you, Trustee Kaplan-Murth, and I'll try to be as brief as I can here. There was a period of time in this district from about 2008 to 2018 where the district, in terms of its achievement, and I would say even its well-being, steadily, slowly increased a percentage point per year, which doesn't sound like a lot in one given year, but over the course of that 10-year period, it amounted to about 15 percentage points, moving the district from about average or below average in some areas to well above provincial average. And part of the reason that happened is that we coordinated, we organized ourselves by doing less better. We had a framework. I'm just going to give you one example. This could be a 3-hour response. I'll try to be brief and control myself, but we had a balanced literacy framework that we honed in at every single site and worked that framework, that approach with all of our learners. We differentiated the context, but we really had a very structured approach to what we were doing, and I think we did it well. We had more resources for professional learning, there's no question, so we've got some work to do in that area, but what we're talking about here to get to the learning is honing in on effective instructional practices. What the research says is working for students, and that's changed. It's no longer a balanced literacy framework, it's a structured literacy framework that has more elements, to be honest, of explicit teaching of reading. But all to say, part of what this opportunity to reorganize ourselves infrastructurally will also allow us from a pedagogical perspective to really stop doing too many different things and really hone in on what the research is saying and makes a difference. And I can tell you firsthand, in my week-to-week visits to schools, our educators are working hard, but there's much greater variability than there was in that period of time when we were making slow, steady progress. I don't need to tell you what the results have been in the district for the last 6 plus 7, 8 years. It's not to discredit. There is a point to having a pedagogical strategy and also a strategy for wellness and honing our efforts in so that we're not expending so much energy on things that are basically not adding value. So all to say, staff's looking forward to that work. It's part of a professional development plan. As my final comment, I will say things are harder now. We don't have the kind of luxury of occasional teachers we once did. We have shortages now. I'm not sure we have the infrastructure from a ministerial perspective that the literacy and numeracy secretary at the time provided us. So there are other challenges we're facing now we didn't face then, but this is not unachievable. We can do this if we organize ourselves and work together effectively and efficiently.
Okay, the last question I'm going to ask was what areas of this plan can be influenced and what happens after our April vote? But that was the question from my constituents. I would add to that I'm wondering whether, because we don't have a motion from SEAC as to whether or not they support the proposed model. We don't know how the budget for retrofitting the schools is actually going to happen. We don't know about childcare. We don't know about transportation. We have not heard from teachers. I'm wondering, is there a way that we could say maybe we need a little bit more time so that we can get more information and the public can feel that their consultations are more meaningful rather than pushing this for end of April?
Through you, Madam Chair, you know that our school systems work in cycles. Staff is clear to say that we need a year plus of work to prepare for this. Delaying this delays another year in the cycle. Pushing this too far into the spring. That's why there'll be a recommendation before you in April. I will say from my perspective, I think people clearly understand what we're bringing forward. I think they understand the difficulty of that. I think a delay is more attuned to not liking what's being brought forward, but I can tell you we don't have a plan B in Karen's back pocket, that we'd go back, rejig this thing and bring you something different. So I will be honest with the table. I would rather face this straight on, where staff is bringing before you a recommendation around a proposed program model and support for students. And we will bring you a complementary report that has some of the elements of the transition, I will repeat, not worked out to the dollar. We can't do that for you right now anyway in our capital plan. We'll bring you an overview of what we're looking to do, but ultimately, all that would do is delay a difficult decision. With all due respect to the Board of Trustees, staff has been at this for, I'd love to tell you, a year and a half. My first day in May of 2010, as a superintendent, this was the #1 item this district had to get to. That was May of 2010. We either make a decision on this or we simply don't. More time will actually work as a detriment, not as an asset. If there are things the Board of Trustees want to see, please inform me as staff. I'll bring them forward. But we are getting to the heart of a decision here.
Can you just answer that, just in terms of the question of, is there any area where this plan can be influenced?
If we're talking about school boundaries, I'm going to turn it over to General Manager Ostavichuk. If it's other elements around the proposed program model or the review more broadly, I'm happy to answer that, but I think we're talking boundaries here, but I'm not sure.
Madam Chair, through you, I'd like to reiterate that I really want to hear through Engage, there is a survey on Engage. We are interested as planning at seeing every comment out there. I can't respond to every comment. I cannot give detailed answers and rationale behind them, but if people have concerns, I want to hear them and I want to know what they are. We will be assessing whether or not some changes can be made or not. I have to suggest to you right now that, again, because of the complexity of the system that we have currently, the layers and layers of boundaries and programs, to suggest to you that I can go back and rework all of this in a fashion that would be timely to get a decision this spring, that's not the case. If there's something that we can do, though, I do want to hear those comments. And if it is a workable thing, we'll certainly take that into consideration and get back with that in a timely fashion. Big scale, it's going to be unworkable. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Kaplan-Murphy. I have Trustee Lara, then Trustee Nash, then Trustee Scott.
Thanks. I have 3 quick questions that I missed in the first 2 go-arounds. My first question is, can we ensure that there is no gap in French immersion possibility for students who would have been eligible for MFI, but who would like entering grade 3, entering grade 4, to make sure that there isn't a gap in their ability to enter a French program between our flexible entry and MFI?
I'm going to say yes, but I want that double confirmed by the general manager.
We calculated out a phase out of MFI beginning with the first year of implementation 2026. For those students who are younger than that, we think that that gives everyone ample opportunity to enroll in the MFI program and have that last kick at it. For those students who are younger, there is the flexible entry, and I think they're young enough to really avail themselves of that option.
Yeah. The thing I wanted to make sure was that there was no gap where a student is now too late for flexible entry but has missed the window on MFI. I've heard that there's no gap. I'm very happy to hear
There's
that.
actually some redundancy in it.
Okay. I have a question about closing enrollment if as soon as possible. If the intention is to not allow new students into the alternative program, what year we're going to close enrollment if this decision gets made?
Madam Chair, we're looking at a last year of junior kindergarten intake into the alternative program this September.
Okay.
Along with that, there is some consideration right now to, if you will, capping that enrollment in upper grades where it's at.
Okay. Does that mean that the intention is not to allow people to transfer in September if they are not already enrolled in the alternative program? Okay.
We haven't fully fleshed it out, but that is certainly something that we are looking at and think would be prudent to do just from a numbers standpoint.
Okay. My last question is, how do staff intend to bring the feedback that we've heard about from Engage back to the board? I appreciate that staff are going to have a chance to take a crack at all the public feedback. How are we going to bring that back to the board for discussion and consideration?
Through you, Madam Chair, it's an excellent question. Trustee Lyra, there's through both the Engage survey and the community-based consultations, our strategic business analyst, Kenan, will be analyzing the input brought forward through not the regular thought exchange platform of the sharing of ideas, but of essentially commentary that's text-based for themes. That's part of the reason why the final date for sort of input will be March 25th, so that he'll have a little bit of time to turn the data, the feedback around for the April 8th report, so that the Board of Trustees can see what the commentary was across interest groups. And what I mean by that is community members, staff, et cetera. So that'll be part of that report for April 8th.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Trustee Lara. Trustee Nash?
Yes, thank you. Again, I cannot overstate the shock and betrayal that is felt in my zone, which is seeing unprecedented changes to its family of schools. So I would ask again that we review very carefully what we are proposing, because it did have very devastating impacts on my family. So again, I hope that there's a possibility of reviewing.
Through you, Trustee Nash, respect your commentary and the voice you're bringing for your community. As General Manager Ostafchuk has said, we will look through the commentary. If there's anything that can be adjusted in any way, we'll look to do that. We know most of it won't be in terms of a comprehensive plan, but we'll do our best to address any things that come to our attention that may be adjustable in any way.
All right. Thank you, Trustee Nash. Trustee Scott?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to everybody for a really good discussion this evening. I think one of the things when we talk about potentially delaying this decision, or maybe we don't have enough information to move forward, one of the reasons we're here is that this question of sustainability and quality of our programming at the elementary level has come up over and over and over again for a long time. And previous boards tried to tackle pieces of it from time to time, but nobody ever really tried to touch the whole thing. And yet here we are in a situation where it really is not that sustainable. We have English programs that are seriously non-viable that we are trying to keep going. We have schools that are overcrowded and schools that are underutilized, and we have children who are, as the director has so often said, being bused right past their neighborhood school because it doesn't offer the program that they want. And we have children who are not even knowing that there is a different program that they could have chosen because they only looked as far as the closest school to where they lived. This is our opportunity to try to make something that is sustainable. And that's why it has come to us in pieces. First, do we do the study? We have some decisions that we need to make this year, and there will be decisions that will have to be made around transportation and other things coming down the road. But if we're not going to go ahead with it, there would not be a lot of point investing the amount of staff time and effort to pull all that additional information together in order to make, to have everything down to a T, every I dotted, every T crossed in the whole report, right through to the end in terms of just where and when are my children going to be having their extended day program before they get bused to school or before their school bell time is. And it's those kinds of things that will come because we have already an established framework for doing extended day program. We have an established framework for doing transportation, but there's no point in working that out unless we're reasonably sure that we're going somewhere with the decision, A, on simplifying our program structure, and B, have some reasonable idea of, okay, if we implement this, what does it mean for school, grade, and program configurations? That's where we are now. The other things will come later. But I think we really have learned a lot this evening, and I think we really can't delay the decision for the other pieces, because if we're not going to proceed, there's no point in putting the work in to do the other pieces. Thank you.
And I don't think Chair Scott could have said it any better. Is that a hand, Trustee Dixon? Okay, so we will go to Trustee Dixon and then we can wrap up.
Through you, Chair, I guess it's directed back to the director. We've all gotten a lot of emails from our constituents, and I guess, and a lot of our colleagues' areas have been affected. Have we looked to be going into those areas to actually listen? And I didn't realize we had an engage. So, if I'm not sure a lot of parents know they can actually go and make comments instead of sending us these emails. So,
Through you, Madam Chair, I'm going to turn it over to General Manager of Communications, Diane Pernari, just to give a bit of an overview of where individuals can go to give input. It's important, as has been shared, that we hear that input. We don't want to lose sight of that. And we have sessions in place for staff and for parents, guardians, and caregivers. We're asking our staff to come to the staff session so that we can hear from staff, allowing us to then hear from parents, guardians, and caregivers at those sessions. So we've got a multitude of consultations taking place. I'll turn it over to Diane for a comment on some of the detail.
Through you, Chair. We've been using Engage since the fall and possibly the spring actually of last year. It's in every parent, student, and staff update. It's in fact been in the last several updates directly from the director's message. So we've had great feedback and pickup. We've had over 30,000 views of the Engage page just since January 10th when we posted the report. Everything is posted to that specific page on Engage by category, by subject. The school locator, the proposed school locator is only on the Engage page to ensure there's no confusion. So the current school locators are on the website. The proposed one is only on Engage with all of the reports, all of the data. There is actually, in fact, the online survey is there for students, for staff, and for parents. And in fact, Karen's team did a great deal of work, and my team did, to post every single boundary map is there. So if anyone wants to see them, they are there, alphabetized on that. And the consultation dates, the timeline is there, the locations for each of the upcoming consultations. There's Thursday, and then there's the 17th and the 24th. So pretty much everything should be in one place for people to find. And we have had quite a bit of feedback already to the online survey from students and staff and parents. In fact, we had a big pickup a couple of weekends ago, the student voice, which we were very happy about over 500 responses on that snowy weekend. So maybe not enough for them to do, but they filled out the survey, which was great, because we want to hear the student voice as well.
All right, thank you, Trustee Dixon. All right, so we have a couple of items to wrap up this evening. So we're gonna thank you again for the very long and fruitful discussion. I couldn't said it better than Chair Scott, though. So we're going to move to item 8, report from statutory committees, and I'm going to call for a mover to receive the report from the Parent Involvement Committee dated November 20th, 2024. Trustee Nash, are there any errors or omissions? Seeing none, all those in favor? And that carries. I'm now going to call for a mover to receive the report of the Special Education Advisory Committee dated December 4th, 2024. Trustee Kaplan-Murth, are there any errors or omissions? Seeing none, all those in favor? And that carries. Moving on to the Parent Involvement Committee, I am now going to call for a mover to receive the report from the Parent Involvement Committee dated January 15th, 2025. Trustee Nash, are there any errors or omissions? Seeing none, I will now call the vote to receive the report. All those in favor? And that carries. Moving on to item 8.4, I'm now going to call for a mover to receive the report for the Advisory Committee on Equity dated January 30th, 2025. Trustee Blackburn, are there any errors or omissions? Seeing none, I will now call the vote to receive the report. All those in favor? And that carries. All right, and now we are moving on to items for information, and I'm going to look to Chair Scott or Trustee Jenkins to provide an OPSPA report.
No report this evening.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to look to Trustee Lee for an OSTA report. And there is no report this evening. Are there any questions for our colleagues? Trustee Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair. So certainly this evening we've talked a lot about transportation, and a lot of parents have been asking, when would they get information for the new transportation routes and bell times? And I wonder if OSTA could prepare or let parents know what that timeline looks like.
So as mentioned by the director, OSTA has not been directed to take on any of this work yet until the EPR has been, if it is approved at this board table, because that's a significant amount of work beyond their normal planning for September in the new school year. So should it be approved, should the EPR be approved this year, OSTA would work on the planning next year. The deadlines for any bell time changes is the end of February to be communicated to families. So next year, so February 2026, if any school has a bell time change from the existing one, more than the 10-minute allotment would come back to this table for approval, but within the 10-minute allotment would be communicated by the end of February 2026.
All right, I'm seeing no other questions. We're going to move on to items of new business. Are there any items of new business this evening? Seeing none, then I'm going to call this meeting adjourned. Thank you for the fruitful discussion tonight, everyone.